Hello, and welcome to the online version of English 242. My name is Todd Pierce. I'm a professor at Cal Poly in the English department. I teach classes in literature, creative writing, and the history of animation. This online class will cover the history of American literature from the early 1800s up through the present. Even though this class is arranged online, I'll teach it as though it were a lecture hall section on campus. But for the most part, we won't have a single 2-hour lecture. I'll break the audio lectures into individual topics, maybe 20 or 30 minutes in each file, arranged around a single story or a set of chapters or a group of poems. But this means, for most modules, you will have multiple audio lectures to engage. Honestly, I think you'll enjoy the class more this way. Also, it'll give you a chance to take a break between topics. In the catalog, the official description says that this class covers American literature from 1830 up through the present. A long time ago, I used to teach this class as a survey of all genres of written literature from that period, such as drama, poetry, nonfiction, memoir, letters, and fiction. And here's what I found. Students left that class with some concepts about the development of American life as expressed in literature, but with little understanding about the components of literature itself and its aesthetics. In our class, we will primarily follow the development of fiction, as this is the period in which fiction invents itself. Most people don't associate the development of fiction with the development of technology. After all, you can write a story with a pencil and a piece of paper. And paper is a type of technology, I suppose, but paper, more or less as we know it today, has been around for about 2,100 years, invented in China as a substitute for parchment and papyrus. But after the invention of paper, it would take centuries and centuries for humanity to develop an effective tool to mass-produce written messages. The original Gutenberg hand press was a labor-intensive piece of technology, designed primarily for small printing jobs of a few pages. With the Gutenberg press, a printer set individual characters of type into the plates by hand to form words and eventually sentences. Once that was done, the printer would place a blank piece of paper on the press, ink the plates, then pull down a lever, creating contact between the ink plates and the front and sometimes back of the paper to produce exactly one copy. The printed page was removed, typically hung from the rafters of the print shop to dry, and a new blank piece of paper was inserted into the press to make a second copy. A typical print shop in the 1600s with multiple employees might produce 1,500 page impressions in a single workday, something that a Xerox machine can now do in a few minutes. The types of material that were produced by the Gutenberg press were typically short, such as political tracts or newspapers, perhaps 4 or 8 pages in length. The Gutenberg press was also used to create books sometimes, but because of the labor cost of creating a book on the Gutenberg press, these books needed to be used for decades, such as the Bible, which would have taken a print shop months and months to produce, with the end result being maybe 200 copies. To create fiction as an effective and financially viable form of entertainment and art, the labor cost for print work would need to be decreased, and the speed for which copies were made would need to be increased. In other words, another inventor beyond Gutenberg would need to create a motor-powered automated press to drastically increase the efficiency of production. There are examples of fiction before the development of the steam-powered press, but mostly these are hobby or even vanity projects, in which the author was also a printer or the printed material was underwritten by a wealthy author. Steam-powered presses began to appear in the early 1800s, with early devices capable of producing 1,100 page impressions per hour. In other words, even the early steam-powered presses increased a print shop's output by 600%. This technology became the key for the emergence of fiction into popular American culture. Fiction can only exist as a popular art form when the cost to print magazines and books decreases to the point where the average family can afford them. If the average family can't afford books, the art form inside of them, by design, can't be popular. By the mid-1800s, steam-powered presses began to shift printed material, books in particular, from luxury items into common elements of American life. To view literature from this angle, it's clear that fiction didn't create itself as a popular form to fill an artistic need. Fiction also didn't create itself because of one writer's focused futuristic vision. Fiction in the Western world created itself as a popular form because the technology existed to support its distribution. And when that technology first emerged, a few writers, curious as to how stories might be presented to adult readers, began to explore how drama, essentially, might be combined with print to produce new narrative experiences for an audience beginning to engage printed material in new ways. Most of these early writers of fiction didn't think of themselves primarily as fiction writers. In his day, Edgar Allan Poe, now one of the best-known early American short story writers, was primarily known as a writer of nonfiction and criticism, and then he was known as a poet, particularly for his poem The Raven. And last on that list, way down at the bottom, he was known as someone who wrote fiction. Fiction was the new art form, and in the early 1800s, not nearly as respectable as poetry. Fiction also didn't have the traditions and rules that guided poetry's production. Now, most readers think of fiction as expressing a rich presentation of character combined with an original plot and set in a deeply realized world. Yet when the technology first emerged to support fiction as a popular form, writers in their early experiments in fiction really warmed up to these elements as key aspects of their work. In our class, we're going to watch the form of fiction invent itself. The early stories will have goals and aspirations that might seem now to be entirely outside of contemporary traditions of fiction. In our class, we'll see setting emerge, then plot, then characterization, and finally various elements of prose style. We'll also sample some poetry and nonfiction, but mostly to examine how it shapes the world of fiction. You should know this up front. In ways, the early stories for this class will be the most difficult. In part, the language is about 200 years old. That will be one hurdle. Also, the concept for what a story might accomplish is vastly different from a contemporary understanding of what fiction might deliver. So the form of these stories might seem to you a bit unusual. But more on this in the next lecture. This is just our welcome lecture. Today I have very simple goals for you as a student in this class. I want you to 1. Read the syllabus posted online, particularly the policies about tests and quizzes. If you have questions, post them on the discussion board. I'll answer them. 2. Make sure you feel comfortable with the delivery mechanisms for this class. This class will use primarily podcast-style lectures. I'm using audio mostly so that you will have the opportunity to go on a walk while listening to class if you choose, or go on a drive. You can also, of course, listen to class lectures at your desk and take notes. From time to time, I might include audio lectures previously delivered to a live class and recorded. In terms of assessment materials, this class will use objective timed tests and online timed quizzes. From time to time, we might also watch part of a video, particularly for historical reference. If these types of online materials aren't a good match for your learning style, you might want to consider other online options this term. There are many ways to approach an online class. And that is why, in the very first lecture, I'm listing the types of material that we'll use in this class. I want to make sure that everyone feels as though they've found a class that is a good fit for them. 3. By now, hopefully you've ordered or purchased your books. We won't need them this week. All of the readings for this week and next are online, but we will need them very soon. And lastly, 4. Read the assignments for our next class. For our next class, we'll examine how the ideas of the American Enlightenment fade into the aesthetic of American Romanticism. Romanticism is a literary and artistic aesthetic of the early 1800s. The early 1800s, as you recall, is the period in which the first steam presses vastly increased printed output in Europe and America. With this, early American writers who experimented with fiction were largely guided and influenced by the aims of Romanticism, particularly in how it shaped poetry and nonfiction. Your reading assignment is identified in a single online packet called The Romantics, Part 1. This packet includes a textbook chapter, headnotes on American authors, and 2 short stories, Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving, published in 1819, and Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne, published in 1835. These are well-known early American texts, typically assigned in college survey courses in American literature. In a course like this, we can't read every Central American text. There are things we're going to miss. But as we move forward, you'll find that most assignments in this class represent some of the best-known and most influential texts for the era in which they were produced. So there you go. Those are your first assignments for this class. Read the syllabus, post questions if you have them to the discussion board. If you've never taken an online course, you should at least look at the discussion board to see how it works. Consider your skills as an online student and make sure you are comfortable with the types of assignments required for this particular course. Next, order your books if you haven't done so already, and most importantly, read and, if you choose, take notes on the literature packet posted online, The Romantics, Part 1. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, that some of the most challenging readings will be the early ones, largely because they're using a style of language that isn't familiar to us today. And also, their idea of fiction 200 years ago is very different than how we think of fiction today. We will begin with more detailed lectures in the next module. Welcome to the class. I'm glad you're here.